Okay, so we're going to be moving along fairly quickly here. Just to summarize here, I've taken my biga, which I started the day before, and I added my water to my biga just to break it up into pieces. You'll see it on the recipe for focaccia. We're making focaccia today, by the way. Mix it up so that the biga is thoroughly dissolved into the water. In the big bowl, I have salt, yeast, and flour. I'm going to mix those in. Actually, correction, the salt and the olive oil are sitting out in front. So as I get it mixed together, I'm going to put it in the salt, the olive oil, and we're going to give it a good mix. It's a fairly wet dough. But once it starts coming together as a cohesive mass, I'm going to put it out onto the bench, and we're going to give it some kneading and some slap and fold in order to bring it into a nice cohesive structure. There we go, take off my watch. We're going to go ahead and put this out on the bench and get it together. This dough is fairly wet, as you can see. But like I always say, a moist dough makes a moist bread. So we're going to mix this together. As you work with it, it will start to get smoother and smoother as you work with it. I think I put in about 5 minutes of mixing here by hand. I am making an alteration to the recipe in that the recipe says just to mix it and then to let it sit for 45 minutes for bulk fermentation. I decided since I'm going to mix it a little bit less and mixing by hand, I'm going to put it in an oiled bowl and I'm going to let it rest for 30 minutes and ferment. Then I'm going to fold it. Then 30 more minutes and I'm going to fold it again. That will help increase the strength of the dough and help save me some time in kneading. But as this dough is coming together, you can see it's still pretty sticky. It's sticking to the bench, sticking to the cutting board. Don't let yourself get frustrated by that. Just go ahead and keep working the dough. The gluten will develop and it will get stronger. But expect to spend about 5 to 8 minutes doing this hand kneading before it starts to look like it has a smooth, glossy texture. So notice as I use the bench scraper here, I haven't completely kneaded this dough, but as I work the dough and slide it along the cutting board, look at the smoothness of the outside skin. It starts to develop gluten very quickly. It starts to develop a nice tight outer skin, which tells me the dough is actually quite ready to be fermented. So like I say, now that it's been brought together, I'm going to put it into an oiled bowl. I'm going to let it ferment for 30 minutes, and we'll be back to fold. Okay, so we're back after 30 minutes. We're going to perform a fold on this dough. It is thoroughly rested, and after 30 minutes, I'm going to wet my hands, give it a nice stretch, and fold. And stretching it, you'll see that it gets very smooth on the outside surface. That tells me that the gluten is forming very nicely. Spin it around, do another fold. Every time you do this, it'll strengthen the dough It'll redistribute the yeast, redistribute the temperature, and slightly degas the dough. But what you should end up with is something that's far superior than when you started. So we'll cover it up and go for another 30 minutes. Okay, so going fairly quickly here. This is our second fold. Stretch and fold, all 4 directions. The dough is getting very elastic. It's getting very full of air, and it is really looking good. So we'll be ready to bring this out of the bowl to do final shaping and proofing in the next stage. Okay, so we're back. We already performed a second fold, and we rested the dough for 15 minutes. It's getting quite large now. So I've got a sheet pan prepared with some parchment paper. We're going to take the dough. Just going to carefully dump it on out. We don't want to pull and tug on the dough. We just want to let it fall out of the bowl naturally. We don't want to pull any of these wonderful air bubbles that we've worked so hard to get into the dough. At this point, I'm going to take the dough and dimple it. So I'm going to get a little bit of olive oil. And we're going to put my fingers in olive oil and dip them into the oil so that then I can dimple the dough. This will keep the dough from sticking to me, but it also covers the surface in a light layer of olive oil. Dimpling is very traditional. It creates a wonderful looking texture on the top of the dough, but it also provides little wells for olive oil to collect in. After we dimple the dough, it'll be ready for proofing. And this dough will need about an hour of proofing to come up to its full volume. So I'm going to cover it with a piece of plastic again. Set the timer for about an hour. Come back, and the dough should have risen quite a bit during that hour. And we'll be ready to put on our garnish. Okay, so we're back. Proofing is finished. The dough has increased in volume. And do a little bit more dimpling, a little bit more olive oil. The dough should feel light and puffy, full of air. Now for a garnish, what I'm going to be using is cracked peppercorn or pepper, a little bit of salt, so some kosher salt, and some fresh rosemary. Fresh rosemary is very popular and very traditional in that it grows naturally and wild in the Mediterranean. A very popular, simple garnish for this focaccia. You could use almost anything, though, for a garnish. The important thing with focaccia, just to remember, is that it's not pizza, it's a bread. So it can't have too much garnish or it'll never bake correctly. So we put a very light garnish on. We're going to go off to the oven and bake it at 450 degrees for about 20 to 25 minutes. All right, well, here's the focaccia as it came out of the oven. Focaccia is meant to be something of a flat bread, which you can see. It's not very tall. But focaccia traditionally means from the fire. So this was bread that in ancient times they would throw right in the fire on the coals to bake it. And today it remains basically unchanged, except that we don't use a fire directly. On this side, particularly lo-fi, I just garnished with salt and pepper and some fresh rosemary, although you can dress it up quite a bit more. There's no harm in putting cheese on top. no harm in putting sliced tomatoes. While the dough is soft, you can press whole cherry tomatoes into the surface, whole olives, things like that. Really dress up this. It's not pizza, but it's a sort of a close cousin to pizza. And it's just not meant to be served as like pizza is. It's meant to be served as a bread, which is a side to a meal. So if you put too many toppings on this bread, it will stay wet and it won't properly bake. The reason why we can put so many toppings on pizza is because it's thin. This is not. This is about 2 inches thick. So being so thick, it's really more meant to be cut apart into either slices or into wedges. So there's your focaccia. I would like to see your focaccia when you get a chance to make this. I think you'll find that it's a lot of fun to make. It takes only about 3 hours total to make. I let mine proof for about an hour. The big difference that I mentioned before was that we, instead of just doing a straight fermentation of 45 minutes, we did 2 folds with 30 minutes in between. And I did that so that it would strengthen the dough and create a better volume to this loaf. Anyway, I'll look forward to seeing your work on Talon, and we'll see you soon.